Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we have a brand new guest joining us on the show. His name is Herb Montgomery. He's written an incredible book called Finding Jesus. A fundamentalist preacher discovers the socio-political and economic teachings of the Gospels. And so, Herb, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited you're here.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. So before we get into your story, into your journey, into the book, give us the quick intro to Herb Montgomery. Who are you? What do you do? How do you spend your days? Tell us what we need to know.
Sure. So today, presently, that's the
Mhm.
right word. Presently, I am director of Renewed Heart Ministries. We are a not-for-profit ministry that is passionate about helping people discover the intersection of their faith
Mm,
and societal engagement. You know,
mhm,
some people, there's various opinions. But there are those that believe that their faith should have also a social impact,
yep,
and we see the Christian right has had that since the 60s and 70s, but the left seems to be trailing behind a little bit these days, and so we're a ministry that takes seriously the ethics and values that we encounter in the various versions of the Jesus story that we have in our sacred text.
mhm,
And we try to help those who are Christians or who resonate with Jesus in any way, translate what they see in the story into positive, life giving engagement
mm.
with social issues today.
Is this an organization that you founded or did you hop on
We,
board?
we founded it in 2007. So we've
Okay,
been in existence for quite a while now.
that's awesome. It sounds like it's kind of like in the
We weren't
camp of
always, we didn't always have this focus.
sure,
That's
sure,
been since about 2014. Sorry, I didn't
got
mean
it.
to
So it's
interrupt.
evolved a little bit,
It has.
as all things do.
Totally.
As all things
That's
do,
right.
right? Yeah.
That's right.
No, I feel like the podcast. I mean, I founded the podcast in 20. Started brainstorming it, I should say, in 2017, and then 2018 it kind of kicked off, and it's evolved a lot since then. But I think the things that we birth, right, ought to evolve with us as we evolve and grow. But it sounds like what you're doing is really like in the camp of like public theology, right? Because I feel like there's a sense where it's very easy for us to leave our theology in the comment sections, especially when you move to the more progressive side, because you're in communication with maybe people who are still on the conservative side, people from I know like from my former tribe. It's just very easy to go and talk about these different verses, talk about these different ideas, these different doctrines, and you leave it there and you go on with the rest of your day. Whereas you're encouraging people to bring their ideas with them into society, into the world, and use those things to make a difference.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it, Glenn.
Mm.
I like that. I would agree with
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, because I know I've noticed that in myself. It's very easy to get stuck in my head, and then all of a sudden, I just leave everything in there. I
Yeah.
don't do anything with it, right?
Right. Right. Right.
So, I'm interested to hear a little bit about your journey. You talk about it obviously in the book. You weave what you've learned about God and Jesus and all the things into various pieces of your story, and you do it very, very well. But I'm really hoping to hear a bit about your journey of deconstruction, and in particular, kind of maybe what led you to the rethinking of your fundamentalist approach to faith. Like, was this a gradual process for you? Was there some maybe big event that really acted as the trigger for all these different things? Like, maybe take us into that story a little bit.
Sure. So, very, very brief background. My first introduction to Christianity
Mhm.
was when I was just preteen. My parents, we lived here in West Virginia at the time, where I live today. And my parents became enthralled with Jim and Tammy Baker's ministry, PTL, down there in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And so my folks sold everything they had and we moved down there to PTL. That's where I grew up for about the next 5, 6, 7 years.
Mhm.
My mother was a cosmetologist for the PTL show. She never did Tammy's makeup, but she did do Tammy's hair once in a while.
Mhm.
And she was my stepfather was a cameraman and sometimes usher for the PTL show. That was my introduction to Christianity. When that whole thing fell apart, we moved back up here to West Virginia, and I really got pulled in. I was about 14 or 15 at the time. Got pulled into more fundamentalist Christianity, and but more kind of marginal Christianity. They were just on the edges of Christianity within
Mhm.
fundamentalism still, not progressive by any means. Um, but when I was about 16 years of age, I'd been sent off to a Christian boarding school. I had a radical encounter at that time with God's love, as I understood at that time, as I would label it at that time. And that worked for well till about 2010, 2009, 2011, somewhere around in there. It was the most loving version of fundamentalism that I felt like I could
Mm,
present or encourage others to embrace within Christianity. It was loving fundamentalism, loving evangelicalism, just the most loving, inclusive version you could have that I knew up to that point. In 2009, I had published my first book called Finding the Father, which was I wouldn't title it that today, but at that point in my journey, um, I had discovered some things about my birth father that contradicted everything I'd been told about him. And that
mm,
led me through a significant deconstruction in um, what I'd always been told about God in the context of God being a heavenly father. Well, what have I been to? There's all kinds of questions that came out of that. Then that's not
mhm,
what this book is about, but that's where I was at the time in 2009. I'd written a book on that story,
mm,
and I was doing an interview on the second largest Christian radio station in America at the time. It was in DC, and switchboard was lighting up, and I came back that night, and this was the beginning of where I am today.
mhm.
I came back to the hotel that night, and when my head hit the pillow, I felt like we were having all this success with this new book, and I was having success in ministry, but there was still something missing, still something eating at me. So I went back to, of all things, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. And what I discovered in the Gospels, it started that night in that hotel room, but over the next few months, what I discovered in the Gospels was that everything that I was passionate about preaching, even in a loving version of evangelicalism or in a loving version of fundamentalism, everything that I was passionate about preaching and teaching, Jesus never talks about in the Gospels. And everything that Jesus was passionate about in the story, I
Right.
never talked about in my ministry. And so I
A
was
real
like, this is
disconnect,
yeah.
right?
I was like, what is going on here? So I started going back to the Gospels and trying to take them seriously. I'd spent my
Mhm,
ministry, my career basically, trying to get in the headspace of various different theologians in Christian history and the Christian movement, and trying to present a most loving version of those. I'd never given that courtesy to Jesus in the Gospels. So I went back to the Gospels, trying to get inside the headspace of Jesus, at least in the stories, the
mhm,
story Jesus, right?
mhm.
Try to get inside that headspace. What were the themes? What were the values? What were the ethics? What were the passions that Jesus had in the story? And that led to significant deconstruction. I mean, there
Mm,
were all kinds of things that I began to bump into, and it's that story that this book is about.
yeah. Yeah, it's when you really start to read the Bible is when you start to run into those things, right? Because, I mean, I know for me, like, I went to seminary, I went to Bible college, like, I read the Bible. But then when I started to really read the Bible, there was just a lot of things I'm like, "Oh," like, I didn't realize that was there,
Right.
right? And I think it's John Dominic Crossan says that the Bible, is a great book that, it's easy to cross all the T's and dot all the I's until you actually read it. Then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, there's a lot there that you have to think about and you have to process. So I love that. It seems like what like, from your story, it's almost like the Jesus that you met was different than the Jesus that you were taught about, or maybe even the Jesus
Absolutely.
that you did teach about for many years from the pulpit and things like that. So I'm wondering, can you talk maybe about like maybe just for our listeners, maybe two or three big pieces of that
Mm.
distinction? Like what were some of your big aha moments? Like, oh, like this Jesus that I'm meeting is not the Jesus that I was taught about. Like, what are some of those big aha moments for you?
Yeah, I would love to share that. Yeah, in response to your previous comment too, those who have no problems with the Bible or the Jesus story in specific are usually those who haven't read it, right?
Mhm.
When we begin to dig in, things begin to unravel. It's like pulling the thread on a sweater,
Yeah.
in many of our religious upbringing. So for me, the first big ticket item was Jesus's teachings on nonviolence. I live in Appalachia. I grew up for a time there in the Carolinas and the South. For me, it was God, guns, and country,
Mhm.
not always in that order.
Yep.
And
We live in
and
North Carolina right now, so that's pretty much there's bumper stickers and flags and everything.
you know exactly what I'm talking about then.
Yep.
And so bumping into nonviolence, but again, I fell into, the white privileged, and I don't want to name names of other, significant theologians out there, but the white privileged Christian male, straight male version of nonviolence, which
Yep.
typically critiques the responses of those who are facing injustice in their
Mhm.
daily lives, but fail to really properly critique the violence of the system that's making them feel like that's their only option.
Mhm.
So I spent some time there, and that was the biggest challenge I think for at that time when we started preaching nonviolence in from Renewed Heart Ministries. We lost about 20% of our financial support
Wow.
overnight. And so we
Wow.
took a major economic hit from our donors at that
Mm.
time. We've always been a shoestring ministry. And when you're a shoestring ministry, to lose 20% is a big bite.
Yep.
So then we started talking about second big ticket item would be Jesus's economic justice for the poor and how charity is different than justice.
Sure that went over well.
Yeah. So there went another 20% of our financial support from our wealthy donors,
Right.
you know. So, so they had a hard time with that. So I was teaching economic justice, nonviolence, in various different expressions, and started teaching inclusion of the marginalized just in principle, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And then I had a friend who spoke to one of their other friends. The other friends, they were a couple that had produced a documentary on LGBTQ people of faith
Mhm.
and their experience in a certain faith tradition. And our mutual friend spoke to them and said, Herb's recent transition, Herb's change over the last couple of years, Herb's growing. I think Herb's affirming in his theology, but he doesn't know. He hasn't applied it there yet. He
Mm.
hasn't. He doesn't even really know we exist.
Mm.
And I had grown up in Christian circles where all of the LGBTQ people that I had known up till that point had been in the closet.
Mhm.
I genuinely didn't know that I was friends with folks in this community at all.
Yep.
They hadn't felt safe to come out to me by
Mhm.
any means, and they probably weren't.
Mhm.
And uh, these people, this couple that made a documentary, they said, "Well, we'll get in contact with her. We won't out you. We will see if he's willing to watch our documentary and start a dialogue, start a conversation." So they contacted me and they said, "Hey, we've made this documentary. What we do is we go around the nation, we rent out movie theaters, we invite people to come do this viewing, and then we have this huge group discussion afterwards. It's really not meant to be experienced individually. You need to experience together in community because it's
Mhm.
that dynamic at the end of the film that really brings change and experience and application." And they said, "What's your schedule?" Well, at that point at Renewed Heart Ministries, I was scheduled, and no exaggeration, I was scheduled every weekend to speak somewhere for the next 3 years on my calendar.
Wow.
And so I said, "Well, they said, here's our calendar. This is where we're going to be. What
Yeah.
weekends do you have open?" And I said, "Here's my schedule. None of
None
these,
of those. Booking
I'm
a
not,
4 years
I,
from now.
right, right." And I said, "I'm totally willing to watch it. It's just that my schedule doesn't permit your method of, disbursement here."
Yeah,
And so they
yeah.
said, "Well, hey, we're going to send you a copy of the DVD." And they literally said this. They said, "When you're done with it, burn it. We don't want anybody to watch it on their own. It has to be a communal event, a community thing." So I said, "Sure, I'll watch it." She contacted me 2 days later and said, "Actually, we've changed our mind. We see you're going to be in Northern California in the middle of the summer in June. We have rented a theater in the town that you're going to be speaking at. Would you be willing, since we're bringing a viewing to you, would you be willing to come
Oh,
watch it?
wow.
We know you're going to be speaking every evening. Would you come watch it on an afternoon? And I was so naive back then, Glenn. There was about 3,000 people I was speaking to every night at this convention. And I just started advertising for them. Hey, here's this new documentary that's out. I've been invited. It must be important. I've been invited to go watch it. Why don't you guys all come watch it with me?
Right, a big party.
It was anything but. That was
Oh,
about the middle of the week of those presentations. And the rest of the week, there was just a lot of tension, is probably the kindest,
wow.
gentlest way to say it. But
Wow.
what I experienced
Mm,
in that documentary and in the conversation afterwards, I felt, and I don't know any other way to put it than this today, I felt like Peter, who had always been told about this group over there, who was watching the Holy Spirit through them
mhm,
and seeing that God made no distinction between them and us.
yeah,
And so who was I to?
yeah,
And so that began, my family was with me during that experience. That began a radical, very very deep reassessment
mm,
of even my deconstruction at that time.
yeah,
And about a year later, I was doing meetings down in Hawaii, down in Honolulu. And night number 4 of this week that I was down there, a lesbian couple came up and introduced themselves to me. And at the end of the week, they said, we would like to be baptized. And I said, well, sure. And then I went to the church that I was speaking at and presented this to them. And they looked at me and said, if you do this, you're not a Christian. If you do this, we don't want their kind here. It lit, quote unquote, is what they
wow,
said.
wow,
And so I talked to I think my daughter, my middle child. She was 8 years old at the time, and she was there. The whole family was with me down there. How can you go speak in Hawaii and not take your family, right? So my
right.
family was with me.
Somebody's got to go to Hawaii to preach.
So those don't happen anymore, by the way. But
Right.
back then they were happening.
Yeah.
And my daughter that night, I said to her, I explained. She was 8 years old, and she could tell I was stressed. And I explained to her in 8-year-old terms what was
Mhm,
going on. And I said, if I do this, we probably won't ever come back to Hawaii again. We'd been invited. We were on a schedule of coming once a year at that time down there
yeah,
to speak.
yeah,
And she loved it, and I said, this is going to impact us as a family in ways that you don't even understand yet.
mm,
And little 8-year-old, I looked up at me and said, you need to do whatever you think Jesus in the story would do.
wow.
So we baptized them that Saturday night. When the series ended, the church wouldn't let us do it in the church. So we went down to the ocean, did it right there on the beach, right there in the water. And then there was a little house church that shaped around them that night as well, that organized right there on the spot to
Wow.
give them a faith community to grow in, that just embraced them and loved them. And so that was the bit. We probably lost 80%. We probably lost 80% of our support once we started officiating same-sex marriages, started baptizing same-sex couples, we were involved with a local expansion of non-discrimination ordinances here in West Virginia. And just word got out. And those 3 years of scheduling all disappeared. They canceled. I had one group call me the night before I was supposed to get on a plane the next morning to go for the weekend. They said,
Mhm,
nope, we're done.
wow.
And so we've been since about 2012, 2014, around those years when all of that was happening, we've been rebuilding Renewed Heart Ministries in a way that we think is holistic and life-giving,
Mhm,
that still honors the Jesus story and the ethics and the values, but seeks to be a source of help and comfort and life and healing, especially from religious trauma in our communities, rather than the source of harm that too often Christians are known for. And I know there are exceptions, but the ones that seem to get the mic are the ones that are doing harm these days.
yeah,
And so we're trying to be something different.
yeah. Yeah, the LGBTQ issue has been probably one of the biggest legs of my deconstruction journey as well, because for me, the biggest one was hell. That was a really big one for me.
Yeah.
and all the different verses about
I
hell and
gave up
everything.
hell at 16, so
Oh, there
that
you go.
was one for me.
I struggled with that one, and that was a big one, and then, end times theology was also very big for me because I grew up in a private Christian school from the 4th grade through 12th grade, then Bible college, it was evangelical Bible college and seminary, so it was very all this thing very ingrained in me. But LGBTQ was a really big thing and probably caused me the most amount of kickback, similar to what you described, in terms of people from my former try, but I've shared a story on the podcast before, but I want to share it with you. I similar to you, like I grew up in a world where I didn't know anybody who was outwardly gay. And then now I
Right.
realize there's probably a lot of people that were in the closet, but there's nobody, I didn't know anybody who said, yes, I'm gay. And so I had all these theories about these types of people, because
Yeah.
everything I was told, right? They're obsessed with sex and, they're, a lot of them are pedophiles, like all these different kinds of things. You just have this image in
It's
your head of
horrible.
what
That's
these people
horrible.
are like, right? And that's
Right.
what when you think gay, that's what I thought. And so, I pastored a church for a couple of years after seminary, and then for various reasons, I left and I got a job at Apple, an Apple store, and I
Okay.
worked at Apple for 11 years after once I got the job. But right away, my first store, there was probably 120 people in this store, and all of a sudden I'm not in my Christian bubble anymore,
Yeah.
because there's maybe like 5% of the people who are maybe like me. And now I've got all these other people who are from different religions. There's people who are atheists, people who are agnostic, which was a new term for me, in that time of my life. Lots of people who are gay, lesbian,
You got to learn real
transgender.
quick to do no harm.
Yeah. And I'm like, wow. So I'm like, this is gonna be an eye-opening experience for me. I remember one of the biggest times was we had somebody in the store who was transitioning, and the managers had a meeting in the morning and called the whole store together and 120 people and said this person's going to be out for a couple of weeks and they're going to be coming back and we're going to their pronouns will be different and their name will be different.
Love
And
it.
I was like, wow. And I thought to myself, I love this person. And I had no idea that this person was trans. I just had no idea. I was just clueless. But then I started to think about people who I was meeting who were like somebody who trained me. He's gay, and his boyfriend worked in the store as well. They were two of the nicest people
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
ever met in
Yeah.
my life. I'm like,
Totally.
these guys are nicer than a lot of the people I went to church with as a kid. I'm like, and I had this like mental explosion into my head. And I remember I went home and I said to my wife, like, these people are not what we've been told that they are. And I was like, I don't know what to do with these 6 clobber verses that I've been memorized
Right.
since I was 4. Like I know these verses
Right.
like at the back of my hand. I said, I don't know what to do with them. I said, but if indeed those verses say what we think they say, then the Bible's gotta be wrong. That's what I said. I mean,
Yeah.
and that was a huge moment for me because to admit that this book that I've been taught is inerrant, infallible, and perfect, to say, I had this experience with these people, and my experience does not line up with what this book apparently says. And that was a huge, huge moment for me in my faith. And, the deconstruction that was early, very early on, and I was keeping a lot of that stuff quiet because I wasn't very outward with it yet because I felt like I got a lot of processing to do, but, that was a big moment for me, and I always look back on those times and be grateful for my time at Apple because it really expanded my theology in ways I wasn't expecting when I applied for the
Wow.
job.
Wow.
Right?
Thank you, Apple.
Yeah, exactly,
Well,
exactly.
so much of your story, Glenn, resonates with me on such a deep level. I will go to my grave forever thankful to the Jesus that my non Christian LGBTQ friends and Christian LGBTQ friends introduced me to. I have
Yep,
seen Jesus in the queer community of faith so much more than I ever had before. And I remember my first convention for LGBTQ folks, religious Christian convention for them that I went to and spoke at. I was introduced. I mean, this was just the tip of the iceberg,
mhm,
right? They
mhm,
introduced me to Black liberation theology
yep,
with James Cone and others. They introduced me to feminist theology, to womanist theology. I was already familiar with Latin, liberation theology, but there was these these various ways of interpreting the Jesus story through non-privileged social
Yeah.
locations and
Yep.
experiences that completely turned everything upside down for me. And to use your language, blew my mind.
Yeah.
And I will always be indebted to the LGBTQ community for showing me where that path begins, saying
Yep.
this is where the road starts.
Yep.
It's up to you what you want to do with this, and just pursuing that. It has radically changed my faith journey, and it's also radically changed the way that I define and follow Jesus today. I still love Jesus or the Jesus story. You know what
Yep.
I mean? I
Yep.
haven't lost that.
Mm.
There's definitely different ways in which I interpret
Mhm.
the Jesus story today.
Yep.
The LGBT community also introduced me to different universalist theologians and grappling through all of that, and that was easy for me. Well, because my story is a little different than yours on that one. That I had transitioned from eternal torment to an annihilationist in my teens,
Mhm.
but from an annihilationist to a universalist later in life.
Yep.
And so anyway, that's my story, and all of these different kind of waymarks, and how I got to what text shaped me, what interactions with people shaped the way I look at the world. That's what this book is about. Finding
Yeah.
Jesus, how some guy who used to think he had all the answers has nothing but questions today.
Yeah. And I think what I'm hearing in both of our stories is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it's experience is the key, right? Because you can have all the theology that you want. You can memorize the verses, you can know what everybody says about everything, but until you have like a real experience with something,
Mhm.
that's like the moment where everything has the potential to change. Cause like for me, you know, like having an experience with LGBTQ people and having proximity to them, whereas in the past I had no proximity at all, that really bred like a sense of empathy in my life
Mhm.
because it was very easy to be unempathetic when I didn't know anybody who was gay, and just I just
Right.
had memorized all the verses. But as soon as I got close to people who were gay and I started to become friends with them and hear their stories, see them cry on instances and see their hearts, that all of a sudden, like I got close to them. Now I felt very empathetic to their story, whereas in the past it was very easy to remain cold to that. So I feel like for a lot of people, like I know I become really frustrated sometimes with some of my people from my past who don't have that empathy. Then I realize they also don't have a lot of proximity because if I ask them, tell me about three people who are gay that you've sat down and heard their story. They don't have
Right.
anybody because they haven't. Maybe they have chose not to. Maybe they don't have the opportunity, whatever it might be, and I feel like for me, it's helpful to remember that you can argue with somebody on the basis of theology, but if they don't have the same experience you do, there's definitely a disconnect that's there.
That's right. Last week, I was sitting on a panel with Jim Wallace, and Jim Wallace used the same word you just did, that proximity.
Mm,
And he was sharing how important that is. He was promoting, I know this is about my book, but he was promoting his new book, The False White Gospel.
mhm,
But talking about proximity and how that changes. And it's not just, I know in the context of our discussion right here, we're talking about LGBT people,
mhm.
but here in West Virginia, where only 2% of the population are people of color,
Yep. Yeah.
any color, you
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Proximity matters there too. And I remember growing up, I was fortunate enough to grow up with a mother who was a cosmetologist, and I remember sitting in the empty chair, stylist chair, listening all day at times when I was much younger, because we didn't have money for a babysitter. So I'd go to work with mom. I'd sit in a chair and do something. This is before
Mhm.
phones and pads and all that stuff. You do something. But I just remember listening to these women all day long talk about what life was like for a woman.
Mm,
And hear these growing up, hearing those stories, and those shaped, the way we look at those kind of stories, shape the way we look at the world as well.
yeah.
So, I
Yep.
mean, proximity is so important. When I was working with the expansion of the non-discrimination ordinances here in West Virginia about a decade ago, what I was told statistically is that the magic number seems to be five. Once you're in proximity, in friendship, not just know about, but once you're in friendship with five people that are different than you,
Mhm.
then your politics, your worldview, your religion, everything begins to change. It
Yeah.
begins to shift.
Yeah. Yeah. You know,
Proximity is vital.
yeah, I mean, once I realized that, like, people who were gay could be Christians, because a lot of people I met at Apple who were gay were Christians. And once I realized that, like, I started to hear them, like, we in the break room, I'd overhear stories, people telling different things about talking about their faith and stuff. Once I started to realize that, like, these people have a much different perspective on the Jesus story than I do. That's a straight
Yeah,
white guy, right?
yeah,
I started to
yeah.
realize that, okay, well, that's like you said, that's just one sphere of perspective. Like there's my sphere, there's this LGBTQ sphere, there's also black theology, like you said, there's also women, like these are different perspectives. And then fast forward to the end of my time at Apple, we moved down here to Charlotte and I got in one of the stores here and I became a business expert, which is now I'm off the floor. So I'm not working on the floor every day, but I'm working with a business pro who were in the back talking to businesses on the phone most of the day. So it's just me and this woman who are working together. And she is a lesbian and she's black. And so now my theology's already been blown open. So I'm totally comfortable with this person. We became really good friends. And she's been on the podcast before actually to talk to me. And but I started to ask her some questions like, okay, you believe in God. I'm a straight white guy. You know what my background is. I said, so do you mind if I ask you some different questions? And she was just so gentle in her responses, but I was able to learn from her, you know, about just things I had no idea. Like white privilege was not like a I had no idea what that meant,
Right,
so for her to, like,
right.
break it down and explain it to me, stuff about, like, patriarchy, stuff about, like, microaggression was, like, a really big thing, like, I
Totally.
all this stuff was, like, not at all on my radar, no idea what any of it meant, but to have somebody like that who she said, "I so appreciate what you do with your podcast because 'cause you're bringing these kinda conversations to light in a world, where people who are like you, people who grew up like you are going to be able to hear these different topics that maybe they never heard before." She's like, "I love what you do." So it was a really easy place for me to ask these questions. And sometimes I would preface it with like, "Please don't think I'm a moron. Please don't think I'm a horrible person. But this is what I was taught growing up. Can you help me understand from your perspective how you would read this Bible verse or whatever?" And it just was so eye opening for me to see that, and that helped me go and to do my own digging to see what other, Black theologians have said and some different things like that, and now I have, like, commentaries on my shelf, like, written by people from all these different walks of life, and they all see these verses very differently, but I think it's really helped me appreciate and deepen my appreciation for the Bible, Jesus, and my faith. So, contrary to popular belief, I haven't given up on Jesus or the Bible. I love them very
Right.
much, I just see them very differently.
That's right. That's right. And I was thinking there too that some of and I don't know who your listening audience is. I don't know what demographic they are, but
Mhm.
there may be someone out there listening to this who says, well, there's so many different ways of interpreting this, and there's so many different ways of looking. How do you know which one is right? Which is a very fundamentalist evangelical response to
Yeah,
hearing the multitude of interpretations that are possible.
yeah.
Which one is the right one? What I've come to understand is that that's the wrong question.
That's right. That's right.
We don't need to be asking which one's the right one. We need to be asking whether or not our interpretation is the most life giving one that we've encountered up to this point,
That's
or
right.
is it death dealing?
That's
And if
right.
it's not life giving, then push it out of the way and make way for an interpretation that's even more life giving.
That's
Because at
right.
the end of the day, it's about being a source of liberation, hope, and healing and life
Yeah.
instead of harm and death dealing.
Yeah.
And so, what's the fruit? And that's what, and then, back to the Jesus story,
Mhm.
that value, that ethic is in there. What's the fruit that it produces? A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So if it's
Mhm.
producing good fruit in someone's life, if it's life giving, that's really the question.
That's
And if
right.
it's not death dealing, it doesn't matter how many Bible verses you have to back it up. You let it go.
Yeah. Yeah. Even when I began deconstruction, like that was I brought that mentality with me, because now I've always been taught to be right. You've got to
Right.
have your answer, you've got to have your response to the question. So now I've got this whole new set of questions. I can remember going to people like Brian McLaren on Twitter and other people like, what do I do with this verse? What do I do with that verse? And because I had to figure out how does all this fit into my theology. And then when I started to expand and hear these other perspectives, again, it was like a mental explosion where like I'm like, I don't know what's right and what's not. And somebody said to me exactly what you just said is about it's about the fruit, and it's about,
Yeah,
does it bear good fruit? If it does, it's good. If it
yeah,
doesn't, it's got to be rethought or it's got to be thrown away. And that was really eye opening for me. And it's allowed me to embrace a lot of different perspectives because you and I can have two different perspectives, but they can both be life giving on some level. And I think that that is the place where we can meet. We might
that's right.
disagree in
That's
principle on
right.
something, but if both of our ideas are able to bear fruit, we can come together on that. So we don't have to see eye to eye. We can come together arm in arm and we can, go forward.
That's right. And we don't need to overextend that generosity to things that are doing harm.
That's
Some
right.
people hear that and say, "Well, does that mean anything goes?" Well, no.
No.
But we don't have to agree as long as it's still life giving.
Yeah.
That's we it's that meme that went around a couple years ago. We can disagree on tea and coffee and still be friends,
Yep.
but you can't. It's not about my existence or my worth or something. I
That's right.
have a dear friend who also, you were talking about your friend at the Apple company. I have a dear friend also who's non-binary and non-white,
Mhm.
and what I thank her for, or they use both
Mhm.
the for the most, is that when I would go with those questions, she would say to me, I'm not going to do your homework for you. Here's just a list of sources.
That's
These are
right.
your various sources. Go read this, go read this, go read this. It's there. You'll find it.
Yep.
She would just point me in the right direction.
Yep.
And I was like, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, she said my friend December said to me, she said so many times, and she said, I'm not saying this about you because she said we're friends, we're having a discussion, but she said so many times people will expect me to educate them.
Hmm.
Like, we'll put the pressure on me to educate them on this particular perspective. And she's like, I'm happy to have a conversation with somebody if they're willing to do some of the work, because it's not
Right.
my job to teach you. And so
Yeah. Yeah.
she said, my advice to you is to bring that into the world that you're going into with your podcast and things like that, because you're bringing up a lot of different ideas that you talk about on your show. She said, use your show notes to point people to the resources, and if people come at you and they want to argue, they want you to teach them and want to educate them, point them to those resources and tell them you're happy to have a conversation with them if they're
After they've
willing to
done the
go and do the
homework.
thing. So
That
she said, that's something that I carry in my life. She said that, as a white male, you're gonna have to figure out what that's gonna look like for you. But she said that's an important, she said for everybody, regardless of what your work is in the world, that's an important kind of characteristic to bring forward. So I
and
appreciate that.
and I'm thankful for that too, because it doesn't rob me of the journey of self-discovery.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's going to be way more just more holistic and solid if I come to those conclusions through those materials than just trusting someone else's word for it.
Yeah. That's right.
And so I love it. I
Yeah.
love it.
One of the things I was thinking of too while I was reading the book and I was making my way through your story is that I think one of the biggest realizations for me, like in all of this work that we're talking about, is coming to a place where I see where I once saw certain parts of the Bible to be very exclusive, like I now see them to be very inclusive. And now that I've
Mm,
seen the inclusiveness, I can't see anymore the exclusiveness that I once saw. And I said this to somebody on the podcast the other day that like for a long time I put my Bible away. Like
mhm.
I couldn't read my Bible apart from the fundamentalist, mindset that I had, like all the stories, all the different things. Like I just saw them all in one particular way. I was like, I just got to put this, I need a break from this book because it's stressing me out too much. And like I need to wrap my mind around it maybe in a different way. So, like one of the verses that came to mind when I was reading is, that verse where Paul says that in Christ there's no condemnation. And for me, like for a long time, like that was my verse. That was like,
Right.
looking back
White
Monday morning
privileged.
quarterback, that's my license to condemn people,
Right.
who I judge to not be in Christ Jesus because they didn't believe things, like I do. But nowadays, like I see, Christ is the logos, right? Christ is the breath of the divine. Christ fills our lungs, Christ surrounds us, Christ is everywhere. And so everyone and all of creation that Christ touches, like there's no condemnation. And like now I see verses like that and I see them as a very very inclusive and not as exclusive like I used to. So I was wondering, has that been true for you? Like, has there been any verses or any parts of the Bible that you hung on to as a fundamentalist preacher, and like now you look at them, you're like, I just don't see that in there like I once did.
Well, surprisingly, we'll take the one that you just brought up
There you
because
go.
I'm not where you're at yet, Glenn, and I'll tell you why.
Hmm.
And again, this is one of those both life giving. We're just different places of our journey. For me, um, I don't think the message of no condemnation for me
Hmm.
is universal. And that is because I used to preach that so much
Yep.
that what I found it doing was just giving people with social privilege in whatever area they had that privilege. It was basically guilt alleviation. It was guilt treatment so
Yep.
that they could sleep better at night. They felt something was off, and rather than leaning into it, they embraced a gospel of grace that let them off the hook for the social harm they were
Yeah.
participating in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can see the message of no condemnation for those who the privileged, the powerful, and the propertied have taught us to condemn.
Hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And I'm thankful
Yep.
for it in that. But and I don't know that it would be condemnation, but
Hmm.
it would be definitely, dude. There's a reckoning that needs to take place. There's some reparations that need to be made, and too often we jump to that lack lack of condemnation, which lets us off the hook, rather than the need to actually make those reparations. And that can
Yep.
be racially, gender, that can be all of the economic, that can be all of it. But what I did hold on to, I did similar to you. I did let go of everything,
Hmm.
in the sense of I stopped reading the Bible in whole.
Hmm.
I had to just put everything aside and start from the ground up again. And but what I held on to, surprisingly, was the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain.
Hmm.
Those were the ones that I held on to, that I didn't reinterpret the way that you reinterpreted yours.
Sure.
I just started interpreting them for the first time. You know, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said that when he read the sermon, he was a theologian, and he said, when I read the Sermon on the Mount, I felt like I was becoming a Christian for the first time. I had never given this. I said, that's just fluff. I'm into theology. You know, that's just fluff.
Yeah.
No, you
Yeah.
go back to the Sermon on the Mount, and it's like, oh, so then that's what I held on to, and then I just started acquainting myself with things from that point, adding, taking away, saying, well, I don't know how to deal with that yet, so it's going to stay on the shelf, and
Yeah.
just, what affirms this. That was more of my journey. Um, uh, there are passages where I probably need to experience what you've experienced,
Hmm.
where you can now take them off the shelf and readdress them in a life giving way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I probably need to experience that more.
Yeah. And I love that because I love that, we can, like you just said, we can have a very different experience with both of those, like, words from Paul, for instance, those words from Paul. But yet what we said before, I think both of our interpretations are life-giving. I think both of our
Right.
interpretations bear good fruit. And I think that you and I might not see everything 100% in the same way regarding that verse, but look at us
Exactly.
having a great conversation and we're able
Exactly.
to do the same kind of work together in the world. And I feel like that's a perfect model and example of what we're talking about here. And
Mhm.
I think you bring up a very valuable point in that it's very easy for the more progressive side of theology to just wipe away all of the quote condemnation words because for me, it's very traumatizing as a child. For me,
Mhm.
growing up hearing all about hell all the time, left
Mhm.
behind theology, like literally going to
Mhm.
sleep at night scared to death that like
Yeah.
I was going to be taken or my parents were going to be taken and I was going to be left alone. Like all that stuff is just horrible. And so for me, coming to a place where I could say, "Oh, there's another way to see this. So let's just get rid of the condemnation completely." It's much easier for me to do that than for somebody else, but that does have repercussions because, like you said, it can let people off the hook. And there's actually a quote that you have in your book, and I brought it up here while you were talking. It's by Jacqueline Grant, and she says, "A
Yes.
theology developed in Europe and America is limited when it approaches the vast majority of human beings. And I think
That's
that
exactly what I'm trying to
right? And
talk
I think
about.
that's the perfect example right there. It's just very
Yes.
easy. That's a it's very easy for, to embrace that as a
White
white
folks love
male.
grace.
Yeah, very easy to embrace that. Like, yes, everybody, there's no condemnation. But then you have people in the world who are enslaved, or maybe their ancestors
Still
were
being
enslaved.
harmed.
Yeah, and they're still being harmed, and they're like, well, wait a minute. Like, well, hold on a second. Like that
Before you
doesn't
jump to no condemnation,
that doesn't seem
can we have a
fair
little change?
to me. Exactly. And so, like, what about like that? Isn't there any responsibility at all that people have to make changes in the world today? And I think that's a very fine line that we need to walk. And so I thank you for bringing that up.
No, my story is a tad just different in the sense that I wasn't coming out of that fear-based experience relating to the divine or to religion. I was preaching, if you go back and read my earlier stuff, I was preaching a pretty progressive, loving, no condemnation, grace-filled message already.
Mm,
And people were resonating with that. That's why the popularity.
yeah.
But there was no social engagement. It was all privatized,
Yeah.
individual, inward focused
Yeah.
or heaven focused, giving people assurance, and having that personal relationship, all of that stuff. And I don't want to devalue that,
Hmm.
but but something that still concerns me to this day, Glenn, is that in my audiences, those who would amen the loudest to a no condemnation message were first in line and most opposed to the ethics of nonviolence, economic justice, and LGBT inclusion. And
Yeah.
I don't know what to do with that
Yeah.
disconnect there.
Yeah.
But what it does is it gives me pause that says, yeah, all that stuff may be true, but if love does not translate into justice in public, then we need to reassess our theology of love.
All right. Last question. You have time for one more question?
Sure,
All
sure.
right.
I got all day, man.
Last
I so
question.
enjoy you, Glenn. You're a breath of fresh air, man.
Thank you.
Having
This
such
is
a great
fun.
time with you.
I feel like we're gonna have to do a part two because I got so many more things I want to talk to you about. I have like a Rolodex of thoughts right now. But my last question for you would be: can you talk to the person for a minute who grew up maybe in like one of our kind of situations, or maybe they grew up in maybe they grew up in that more fear based place? Because a lot of my listeners are from that world where they, hellfire, brimstone, all the different things, and they're coming to grips with how toxic that has been in their life and how traumatizing it's been. And I know a lot of people who have just been tempted to throw the whole thing away, like Jesus, the Bible, church, just throw it all away because I can't deal with it anymore. But I know a lot of those same people still feel some kind of attachment to it, and they're trying to rethink and reimagine, Jesus kind of in their modern day setting where they are today. So my question would be like, as apart from going to read a bunch of books. They can go get your book, obviously. They can go get a whole number of other books and listen to podcasts, things like that. How can people go about trying to cater or create that kind of experience with Jesus, like you talked about, like not just having a intellectual experience with Jesus, but having a real life experience with this real life Jesus that we've been talking about? Like what from the heart of a pastor, like what would you say to those people who are dying to have that be real for them?
I would refer back to a previous part of our conversation, and it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself because I am. Especially for those who there's so much religious trauma and harm that you've got to set the entire subject aside.
Yeah.
The Bible just so triggering.
Mhm.
Even the Jesus story is so triggering. There's just so much hurt wrapped up in all of that. I would say it's okay. You have permission to set all that stuff aside for a little bit.
Mm.
You may go back to it, you may not. That's okay. Start spending time with people in this world that are different from you.
Yeah.
And if those people, someone in those different communities, different circles, if they give you back Jesus, that Jesus will be more beautiful than anything you've up to this point experienced. Give yourself permission, be gentle with yourself. Give yourself permission to put some things aside. And I critique the Gospel of John so much, and this is totally off topic today, but I critique the Gospel of John so much because it's so different than the justice focuses of Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Mm,
But one of the things that I love about the Gospel of John that I think it gets right is where the other Gospels say there are two great commandments: love God and love your neighbor. The Gospel of John says, no, this is my one commandment. This is my one commandment. This is it. This is most important. Learn how to love each other.
yeah.
It's so easy to preach a gospel about Jesus that tries to convince people that God loves them. It's much more challenging for us to listen to the gospel Jesus himself in the stories taught that teaches us how to love one another.
Yep.
And so if you need to set it all aside, that's okay. Go out there, get in proximity with people that are different than you, and learn how to love your fellow members of the human race. That will be so healing for you. And once you get to the other side, once you get past this for a while, and I don't want to say the other side because that journey
Mhm,
never ends, right? But
mhm,
but
mhm,
once you get further down the road there, you may have Jesus in certain parts of the Bible, at least,
mhm.
given back to you along that way, but you don't need to worry about that right now.
Yep.
Just go out and learn what it's like without all the religious noise in the back of your head. Go out there and learn how to love people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so
It's
good.
life giving for you much more than it ever will be for them.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, Jesus is bigger than the Bible, right? Jesus is
Hmm.
bigger than the church. Jesus is bigger than all those things. And I think for me, putting the Bible away for that time allowed me to have those experiences, which then allowed me to come back to the Bible later because I wanted to and see the Bible in a very different kind of way as a result of the new lens through which I was looking at it from. And I think there's a great freedom there when you give somebody license, like you just said, that you don't have to read the Bible right now or again. You don't have to. If it's too much for you, don't go to it. Jesus, God, the divine can be found in other places. So trust
When
the
Peter
process.
saw the Holy Spirit poured out on the uncircumcised, he
Yeah.
didn't know how to reconcile that with all the
Mhm.
Bible verses that were anti
Talk about a mental
uncircumcised.
explosion,
Yeah,
right?
right. He didn't know how to do it. So I'm sure he
Right.
had to set that aside for a while and say, I just see the Spirit moving, so I'm going to follow it. You
Follow
know
it,
what I mean?
just see
And
where it
that's what
goes.
you're describing. That's what you're
That's
describing.
that's so good. Well, Herb, we're just about out of time, but this has been a blast. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your conversation, and we'll do
Thanks
this
for
again
having
sometime.
me.
Yeah, and real quick, any place you want to point people to interact more with you and your work online?
Yeah, you can find us at renewedheartministries.com and all of the places that rabbit hole will lead you, depending on how much time you have that evening to sit with your laptop. So, renewedheartministries.com, and you can find everything else from there.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes, and we'll do it again soon.
Thank you so much, Glenn.
Thanks, my
Pleasure.
friend.